You're not just doing automated data profiling. You're actually trying to see them as individuals rather than, the end product of a computer algorithm.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator, specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode where we're talking about all things data, and in particular, using data to make your life easier within a development office context. I'm delighted to be joined to discuss this topic by Adriana Williams, Director of Development for Marymount International School. Marymount is a proudly all-girls international IB world school located in Kingston, southwest London. She is a self-professed data geek who loves to ensure that data sparks joy for development professionals. So we are in very capable hands as we progress through this conversation. Adriana and I, in our conversation, talk about a whole range of topics, including why data can be so helpful within a development office, why data can sometimes seem tricky, some of those barriers that we sometimes experience, and then how we can overcome those barriers in order to really be at home and feel at home as we're navigating data, and in particular GDPR as well. We talk about how to utilise your database to its best ability, how to think about the processes and recording those processes, how to showcase that key data that you're extracting to your community with regards to impact data, and to your leadership team with regards to generating buy-in for your strategy, before finally talking about some of our predictions for the role of AI within databases, helping us to generate some of that fundraising insight which is hidden potentially within your database. And as with all things to do with AI, there are some pros and cons, there's some ethical considerations, as well as some exciting new opportunities that we discussed together. I just want to pause for a moment to say thank you to you. The Independent School Podcast has now passed its second birthday, published more than 100 episodes, and has had over 6,000 listens. As the founder and host of this podcast, I've been really humbled by the number of people who have told me that it's really helped them. From school heads who've rushed up to me at conferences and told me how it's been a real guide for them through tricky times, through to experienced directors of development who have said it reassures them that they're on the right track. So thank you for listening and for all your kind comments along the way. If this podcast is helping you, then I invite you to join the 300 people who have asked to get my weekly emails. That way you'll hear about each episode as it's published, as well as the special offers that I only tell people about when they're on my mailing list. So to get my weekly emails, you can go to www.consultjuliette.co.uk/sign up. Hello, Adriana, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Fantastic to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited about this topic because data is one of those things that people either feel is boring or they're scared of in some way. And actually, this is such an important topic to be demystifying it, bringing down some of those barriers and getting people feeling excited about it. And I love as well that we're titling today's episode, Using Data to Make Your Life Easier, because that's the plan, isn't it? Is to make your life easier, not more complicated by using data. Before we dive into that, Adriana, tell us a little bit, how did you arrive at this point of being an educational fundraiser and passionate about data? What's the root of some of these passions that you bring to your role?
Yeah, I think the journey I had was essentially I did my degree in marketing and strategy, and I decided to do my thesis on alumni giving, or more precisely not giving, because I focused very much on young alumni at my former school. Studying and learning more about this was such an interesting time of my life, because I never thought that independent school giving and fundraising was something that I'd be interested in, but the life-changing ability of education to really make a difference for me was so inspirational, and I could really see how donations and using my marketing and strategy knowledge to really make a difference in the lives of students, in particular children, was so important to me. I've also always had a huge passion for computers ever since I can remember. I've been playing on them. I just really enjoy figuring out how they work. Some people ask me, how on earth do you know how to do that? And it's like, well, in my spare time, I play with computers. And it's really, really interesting and good fun. It's just helped me understand how computers work. And part of how computers work is understanding sequences of data, understanding how information in can lead to information out. And as the saying goes, rubbish in, rubbish out. And if you put good stuff in, you get great stuff out. And the more I worked with databases, because of course, when you start in development offices, usually you're the one inputting the data, you're the one making sure that all the data is there, you're the one pulling lists of people coming to events, or donor lists or anything like that. So I was usually the one kind of playing with these things. And what I try to do in all my jobs since then is try to make my life easier using data, because there's a lot of stuff that your management system can do, and it's just trying to get the best out of it. And by tweaking a few processes, I was able to make my own life so much easier, in terms of bringing out lists, in terms of getting all of the information that I needed out of the database, by perfecting the systems by which I put it in. And that not only helped me, it also helped my managers, the director of development that I used to work for, just to understand what they could actually get out of the database. And also understanding that actually data in is precious. So we spent a lot more time focusing on what data are we collecting. And that has helped us make sure that what comes out of the database is something of quality. So it was essentially kind of a mixture of my my studies, my passion, but also the fact that it was actually making my life easier, to make it more streamlined and understand what the data was being used for, and therefore what I should be putting into the database.
Fantastic. And you've touched on a number of topics that we're going to be coming back to in our conversation today. But I think it's wonderful when people can find a niche, a little combination of different parts of their career and their role where they can really use their skill set. And I think what you've done is perfectly find that combination of a really analytical mind, thinking about data and computers and so on, but then applying it to something that you really care about with regards to the educational fundraising and opportunities for your pupils. So you've given us a few examples there, but I wonder if there are any more examples you can give about the why. Why should people care about data and the kind of the use of data? Can you give us some examples about how data has been helpful in your fundraising?
Yeah, well, I think you can find reasons why in every part of the development office, from reporting to governors to identifying and cultivating donors and volunteers. Some recent examples from me have been looking at event participation. We've been looking at recruiting new volunteers to our Parents Association, and looking at event participation. Who's coming to our events? Who's actually taking the time to spend with us? That's been so instrumental in finding, well, actually, these people are the ones who are warm to us, the ones who have the time to be able to volunteer. And I've been able to recruit through that data. Also, identification and cultivation of donors. If we think about all of the time we spend looking at prospect research and really looking up whether it's a parent, an alum, or a trust, just trying to get to know them, get to understand them, because ultimately, on a human level, we all want to be known and seen and understood. And the more understanding you have of a person, the more you understand what their motivations are and what's important to them, the better case for support you can make to them, and the better they will feel about giving to you and hearing you out. I think that is really, really important. But also reporting internally. I mean, I've found it so helpful to create a development dashboard for my governors and for my senior leadership team. We're a small school, And not everybody has the understanding or the skills in fundraising. In fact, it's quite a new function in the school. We've done fundraising for the whole history of the school, but in a very informal way and very much major donor based. But understanding the importance of a philanthropic community and the culture of philanthropy at the school can only really be demonstrated by data. So looking at the numbers that we have, what we can actually bring out of the database. So, for example, recently we've been looking at giving by age group in our parent body. So looking at who in year 7 or grade 6 has been giving and who has been giving in various year groups has really given me some insight into which are the really engaged year groups who really want to be putting their hands up for the school, and which are the year groups that perhaps are less engaged for very understandable reasons. Perhaps, the children are about to graduate and their affinity to the school is waning, their involvement in volunteering opportunities is waning. But to be able to report those to governors and say, I understand what this community looks like, how this community gives, and these are the points of strength, and these are the points that I'm tackling and making a priority to change. And that's been really, really helpful.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think one of the things that really jumps out in what you've shared there is that idea that it connects to us as individuals of being wanting to be known and seen and understood. And I think sometimes there's a risk that when we think about data, it feels like manipulation. It feels like it's mercenary. I mean, that's because we connect, or we understand that in the corporate world, our personal data is used in quite a commercial way. But in actual fact, there is another way of looking at it, that we want to respect the people in our community by presenting an opportunity to volunteer or an opportunity to give at the right time and for the right project. And so if you can shortcut and use less of their time by only approaching them when you know they're ready for that type of approach, it's being respectful of them. Obviously, there are limits, and we'll talk about GDPR and so on in a moment, but it's actually, there is a benefit to both sides of this. This isn't sort of manipulative, is it?
No, and from my point of view, it's a little bit like walking into a donor meeting and not knowing the child's name. It's you want to. There are some things that a donor will expect you to know, and you can't walk in there completely empty-handed. You don't want to be asking them questions that they will look at you and say, "Why don't you?"
Yeah.
Already know this. The same vein, for example, knowing when not to approach is very important. This is data that is not collected on a computer. I actually go and speak to teachers. I go and speak to educators in my school, and I say, "Look, is this a good time to ask?" Because ultimately, it's a relationship we want to maintain. And if this isn't a good time because the pastoral team know that the child is going through a difficult time, or the parents are in the middle of a move, we have to be sensitive to that as well. So data is not only a nice to have, but it's very, very important to know some things, especially when it's a do not solicit, do not go, do not press at this point.
Yes, absolutely. So there are some barriers, aren't there? So we understand why data is helpful. We understand why this isn't manipulation. This is a tool to develop a mutually beneficial relationship. There are some barriers around why data seems tricky, seems hard or challenging. What are the sorts of things that people have talked to you about?
I think it's twofold. The big barriers are internal and external. So the internal barriers are a lack of confidence with numbers, with the analytical skills that are necessary. And I genuinely think we sell ourselves short as fundraisers. We know our analytical skills are actually really acute. And when you know your community, the numbers just tend to back you up. So the analytical skills, I think, really are there, but we need to give ourselves a little bit more confidence in that and know that actually, it doesn't take much to analyze some data as long as the numbers are good. So understanding giving by year group, or giving by type of gift, or giving by destination of gift or impact. I think we already know that we have those skills already, because most of us are reporting, whether it's to a more senior member of staff or if it's governors. Those analytical skills really are there. And I think externally speaking, the GDPR and the data legislation is significant, I think. it's a tome, and it can seem very overwhelming because it's quite specific, and that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage. I mean, in terms of a disadvantage, it just makes you feel quite impotent and a bit feeling like a lack of confidence in what you can and can't do with that data. And in terms of precision, it's quite precise, but there are still some grey areas which we are left to interpret ourselves. And you feel like you almost need to be a lawyer to understand it. But the way I've tried to explain it to staff here, because it's so big, it's trying to think about the way that you would want your data to be used. It's a big advantage for us as individuals to know that our data is safeguarded much more than it was before GDPR, and that we are treated as consumers with much more deference and respect for our data. When I try to explain it to members of staff, I just say, look, is this a sensible way to use it? Is it a way in which you would expect your data to be used? And if it isn't, then bring it up to someone who would know more about it. So whether that's the DPO, whether it's the bursar, whether it's someone like me, I'm particularly interested in GDPR. But really, there is a kind of a logic to it that I think we can all feel, that resonates with all of us, that we understand this is not how I would want my data to be used. And therefore, I will not proceed with using that data in this way until I have spoken to someone who can reassure me that this is okay. And thankfully, what GDPR has forced many companies to do is to write down our privacy notices and how on earth we use data. And that can be a really interesting source of information. If you've not read your privacy notice of your institution, do so, because it's supposed to be written in clear and accessible language so that anyone can read it and understand it. And that will give you more confidence in knowing whether your data can be used in that way. That's also not to say that the data privacy notice can't be changed. So, for example, if you would like to use data in a different way, if your privacy notice says, for example, you can't look up, do things like wealth screening, which I know a lot of schools don't do anymore. But if you're looking at using data in a way that your school hasn't used it before, that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that you need to bring it up with the person who's in charge of that policy, and they will review it with the governors as to whether it's in the school's ethos to do that.
Absolutely. And wealth screening is actually, interestingly, it's one of the most common examples that people bring up as to feeling constrained by the privacy notice. But often when I then dive into the detail, it's not actually the privacy notice that's constraining, because they do know that could be changed if they wanted to. It's more that it's a discussion around where they sit as a community on the ethical use of that data. That's not to say that wealth screening is inherently ethical or unethical. It's just that or unethical. It's just that every school takes a particular view on what's appropriate and what they feel is the route they want to take with that. So I think what you've beautifully encapsulated there is some of those barriers about data and why it can feel tricky, and then trying to help us to overcome some of those, why it isn't really as bad as all that in reality. And when it comes to the GDPR, I always think of it's quite helpful to think about it in two stages, in the sense that there's a one-off activity of bringing yourself up to speed. And as you say, you may or may not be the person in the school who needs to be, really fully kind of understanding all of this information, all of this data. But certainly someone in the school should have that detailed knowledge. But bringing yourself up to understanding GDPR and how it affects your role. There's the one-off activity of making sure that you've got everything in place. You've got your privacy notices, you've got things which can be changed over time, but basically it's making sure that everything's there to reflect what you're doing at the moment. It's like an audit. And then there's a mindset of knowing what you're supposed to be doing as you go along. So yes, there's constantly referring back to that privacy notice and considering updating where you wish to make changes. But there's also, each time you're processing data in a new way, it's then documenting that decision-making analytical process that you've used with regards to the type of consent that you're using, the legitimate purpose with which you're processing that data. Could you talk us through a little bit what fundraisers should be doing on a more regular basis in terms of keeping compliant with GDPR?
I think from my point of view is keeping process guides up to date is really, really important, whether you're a one-person team or you've got a larger team. Process guides for me have been fundamental in every single job I've had. Process guides, if you haven't come across them before, are essentially ways in which you document a process, any given process, for example, entering a gift, or marking someone as deceased, or adding a communication to a record on your database. All of these processes, especially if you're a one-person shop, they can seem very instinctive, and you just kind of go, well, I know what I'm doing, so I don't need to write it down. I think writing process guides down are really, really vitally important, not only for the resilience of your organisation, which, Juliet, I know you've done a podcast about before, and that's really, really important. I shared that with so many on my team, but also because of GDPR. The legislation asks us to know how we use our data, to know how things are entered, where they're entered, how we store them, for how long, and that sort of thing. So I think making sure that your process guides, whether it's something you do as what I often do is holiday work, and automating these processes as much as possible so that everybody knows this is when this happens, this is what happens. Because, we all would say that we'd love to be in our institutions forever, but there will come a day where you will have to share your work with someone else, either because you're moving on or because you've got a bigger team, which is even better. But knowing that everything is written down, everything is done in a consistent manner, makes that data much safer to keep. But also, it's like I was saying at the beginning, good data in means you get great results out. Yeah. And if it's all entered consistently and well, that means that your analysis will be much, much easier further down the line. Yeah. I think that's something that as a team or as an individual should be reviewed periodically, whatever that period looks like to you, to make sure that it's consistently written down. Because if you should ever have a question about how things are handled in your office, it will be much, much easier to then explain what happens and why you do it in that way.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. And I'll put the link to that previous episode about process and workflows in the episode notes. And certainly one of the things I talked about there was this importance of there being handover to other people, either through time, but there's also a process of reflection that happens, because as you write it down, you're instinctively going to reflect on, is there a quicker way of doing this? Is there a way that we could shift this, which makes it easier to pull the data out again, to report on that particular information? So I think that's really helpful, and it is quite good work to do in the school holidays when things are quiet. To update those process guides so that you've got a sense of consciously reflecting on how you're putting that data in. And then the other thing which I know is really important is knowing in advance what information you want to pull out in terms of data analysis. So it's identifying the goal of that reporting at the end of the day, and then working back, isn't it, to figure out the best way to input the data to ensure that you, for whatever database you have, you can extract that data in an efficient way.
Absolutely. I think, it could be as simple as a participant list for an event. If you need to know their dietary requirements, are their dietary requirements written all in one place? And that will make it so much easier to pull that list afterwards, just before the event, when you're, briefing your catering team on what sort of food can be offered. It's as basic as that sometimes, the importance of where you've put that data, can it be pulled back out again in a way that will be helpful to other people. I think if we're talking about bigger picture and governing board, the great thing about that is that you have some say in what sort of data the governing board should be seeing, because you collect the data so you know what's possible, but also because you know what your targets are and what's important. So whether that's participation, overall numbers, gift aid claims and understanding, what percentage of people are allowing us to claim gift aid. All of that information could be more or less helpful to different people, but the important thing is that if you need it, you need to have it always in the same place so that you can find it again.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And it connects through also to KPIs, doesn't it? In the sense that when you're thinking about reporting through to the governor level, trustee level of your school, then understanding the KPIs that you present is how you're going to be measured. So you don't want to wade through huge amounts of data to get to the key performance indicator. That's what the K stands for. You don't need hundreds of them. It's key performance indicator. But at the same time, quite often we don't always measure the things that we really care about. There are some things that we really care about that we just don't even make an attempt to collect data on and measure. Yeah, interesting. I've got a couple of previous episodes. I'm just thinking I'll put the episode notes, links to the episode notes as well about KPIs, and also one recently about fundraising data and the things we forget to collect data about, the things our data doesn't tell us. So I'll put the links to those as well in the episode notes. So Adriana, when you've got your data, let's think a little bit about some slightly more advanced methods of how we can use the data that's contained within our database to, for example, identify prospects. So anticipating which prospects might be coming into that first stage of our moves management process. Do you have any thoughts on how to prepare that data as you're extracting it and then analysing it for those purposes?
We have several different processes that we go through, and some of them are kind of computer based. So looking at job titles, maybe their email address might give us an idea of where they're working at the time. But there's also a lot of human-based, I would say, data collection. So I tend to speak to many key members of staff at the school to be able to understand actually who are these people, and are they people who we would classify as prospects. There's a lot of things that you can infer from data. So, for example, a postcode and understanding what kind of line of work they're in. It could give you some valuable insight into what their likely income is going to be and what they're likely to be able to give. But of course, data can also go the other way. One interesting insight we've had, 2 items of data that we collect because it's just a matter of course, is understanding, job descriptions and whether there's a parent who stays at home or whether fees are paid in full in advance. Now, that could cut one of 2 ways. It could be because they have a parent at home because they can afford to live off one income, or it could be their parent is at home because they have no choice in the matter. Or, for example, if someone pays fees in full, is it because a grandparent pays fees in full every year and that's how they choose to do it? Or is it because there's enough financial flexibility in that? So we have to be prepared to look at data and how it can be interpreted both ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the data will suggest ideas. It's using our strategic knowledge of the school, so kind of implementing some strategic thinking, understanding your community. Those are the lenses through which all of this data is then fed to provide insight. And I know within the charity sector and the business world, people aren't as much talking about just the data that informs the decisions. It's the insights you're trying to generate. And it's those insights are only really generated when that output of data is filtered through our own understanding of our communities.
Exactly. I think that is so important because one could make an assumption about an element of data that is completely false, and really what it all needs to be filtered through is the understanding of your community and reaching those people who are actually closest, particularly if you're looking at prospects or possible volunteers, is really understanding. You can make a few assumptions and be relatively right with your data, but there always needs to be that human element of just checking in to make sure that what you're thinking is actually correct. And that particularly in small communities and in communities like in education, because that personal touch is so important. It's really, really vital, and actually supports your GDPR work, because you're not just doing automated data profiling. You're actually trying to see them as individuals rather than the product, the end product of a computer algorithm.
Yes, exactly. And because all of our fundraising is based on individual relationships, but especially when we're thinking about major gifts fundraising or legacy fundraising, that relationship that you're building is very much a one-to-one relationship. And so one of the things that I've experienced actually when I was doing face-to-face fundraising myself, I actually performed better when I had a little bit of information going into the meeting. So the data had basically indicated this person's definitely worth reaching out to. It's worth having a conversation with this person. But I didn't perform best if I had pages and pages of data going into that meeting. And then my head was so busy thinking, I've got all this information and I want to get round to the point where I ask them about this particular charity that they might have supported in the past and get an understanding of how big that gift was. Or whatever it might be that the data had indicated that is the next step for the conversation. My brain was divided between being in the moment and genuinely humanly curious about the person in front of me in a friendly and approachable way versus me trying to hold in my memory all this information about them, but I didn't want to share with them that I knew. It was the most uncomfortable thing I've ever done in one-to-one meetings. I think
sometimes there is a balance to be struck, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Knowing enough so that you don't seem like you're completely green and don't understand the context of that person's life, but not knowing so much that you're a Wikipedia entry for their life, and it's actually quite scary.
Yes.
But I think, people want to be known and listened to, and I think that the listening part is really important, but having that context before you go into the room is so helpful, because it means that you don't step on any landmines that could be lying in wait.
Yes, exactly. And then to wrap up our conversation, one of the things that we've been talking about is this idea of showing off and showcasing your key data. And this is about being able to demonstrate to the leadership and the governors that you work for, that you report to, and your community, that you have generated insight, that you have seen patterns, and that you're able to really get excited about those patterns and those insights. Tell us a little bit more about your thinking on that front.
Well, I think that you can always, what we try to do as development professionals is try to get better every time, understand our community better and better as a group of individuals, but also as a group, and to be able to inspire confidence in those leaders and those stakeholders that you need to persuade that this is the right path, this is the direction we need to go in. But also, I think the showcasing key data is not only to those people to whom we answer, but also the people who want to see impact as well.
Yes.
So things that I've seen in many, many publications, not just giving publications, is looking at performance indicators in impact reports, even in accounts for companies. It's really pulling out those key bits that really promote your message. Something I'm going to be doing in my impact report and in our upcoming yearbook is really showing participation rates, because our focus here at Marymount is to make sure that we want to create a philanthropic community, and that is all about participation. And if we look at our participation statistics, there's much to be proud of, and I want them to feel proud of themselves as well as a philanthropic and giving community, that actually so many people have stepped up to give and to support. And those sorts of key data points are not just helpful for us as individuals, as professionals, to show the direction that we're going in, but also to show the impact that others have made on the institution themselves. And it's going to be, it's here to stay. It's not something that's going to go away. Data and showcasing those important points are going to become increasingly important, because our attention is pulled in so many different ways. We have to be able to bullet point and make data accessible to others by showcasing what we have achieved and proving why we're going into a direction, in a given direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's again coming back to that internal and external messaging, isn't it, that we talked about at the beginning. And I think that the future of impact reporting, we've had a lot of people talking about storytelling, and storytelling is incredibly important. But there is this shift also towards there being a more data-driven story that you're telling around impact. And I think that the two have to go hand in hand, largely because our really significant donors are used to seeing that within the corporate world. And so they will be asking questions about how you're tracking impact and the impact that you're having. And so if you're not able to answer those, yes, with some lovely, beautifully told stories, but also with some really hard, concrete data, then there will increasingly be questions as to what extent you're providing kind of a social return on investment, basically, for the money that they're investing in the school through donations.
Absolutely.
As we look to the future, one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about recently has been the rapid progress of AI. And I think it won't be too much longer before we're seeing some of that AI skill set and algorithm kind of complexity looping back into the databases that we use. Now, this is already happening in some databases, which then will present us with less of a barrier around our own analytical skills, because our database will be able to say, have you noticed that there's this particular pattern between event attendance and giving? And it'll actually be based on your data, and it will spontaneously, proactively tell you, the system has noticed there is a correlation here. This could help you in your strategic planning. So I think some of the barriers for data are going to come down. Mm-hmm. My concern on this front, though, is that much as we saw with the information revolution, when suddenly you've got access through Google to every piece of information on the internet, that doesn't necessarily improve your decision-making process. And in a similar way with data, as our databases become more sophisticated and can actually present us proactively with a more sophisticated analytical side of the data that they hold, again, that doesn't necessarily automatically lead to better decisions. I wonder if you have any tips for people around what might be happening in the next couple of years and how they can have a mindset that enables them to navigate that without the fear that might come with it.
I think, yes, you're quite right. I think we're going to definitely see databases that can give us analytical insights without, our prompt, which is fabulous, but also can lead to information overload. Mm-hmm. I think something that I've found very, very helpful is figuring out the why. Why are we doing what we're doing? And it's something that at Marymount we're particularly strong at, because we have a very strong ethos, and it's always been extremely well written down. It's actually something that people understand to be true on paper and within themselves. And that actually helps that decision-making process of, why are we doing this? Why on earth are we fundraising at all? Yes, there's money to be made in it, but really the reason is much more about what impact do we want to have. So if the impact, for example, the reason why we've been focusing so much on participation, the impact is to have a stronger, more resilient community, because this is part of who we are as a school, then actually participation is really important, and we can discount other measures of productivity, of impact, because we think that just the fact of participation is crucial, because people putting their hands up means that they support the school, that they support one another. Mm-hmm. So that has been really important. I think really delving deep into the why can start making you think about, okay, so if this is why we're doing it, then what data do we need to understand in order to see if we're making an impact on this why? Yeah. And what data don't we need? Because actually there's a lot of stuff out there that you don't need. And knowing the difference between this is actually going to make an impact to our values, our mission, our vision as an institution and as a department, and what isn't, is really crucial here.
Absolutely. And it helps you to frame that decision-making process if you know the strategic why behind the vision that you have, the choices that you're making with regards to which type of fundraising you're focusing on, the projects you're focusing on, the demographics that you're particularly focusing on within your community. It all comes from the strategy, which is informed by the data, exactly, but not driven blindly by the data. And I think the other little warning that I need to keep giving to people is that quite often the AI algorithms we know that they are reinforcing bias within the various different areas of society that they're giving us information on. And the precise way that it could happen in this situation would be that if your AI-driven database at some point in the next few years starts telling you, let's say, for example, we've noticed that alumni are much more likely to give to bursaries rather than parents. Actually, that could reinforce a false strategic decision, or a strategic decision which takes you down the wrong track of, we're not going to bother asking our parents because it's alumni that give to bursaries. In actual fact, what we know across the whole sector, and we saw this in the most recent IDP benchmarking data, is that parents do give to bursaries as well as alumni. And therefore, it could be that the bias of the way that you have fundraised from your community in the past is then reinforced by the fact that you're responding to this AI-driven analysis of the fact that alumni are your best audience for bursaries fundraising.
Absolutely.
So I think that also comes back to your comment about the why. It's asking the question of, why is the data telling us this? Is this a fundamental kind of human nature based pattern of behavior, or is the data telling us this particular thing because we have behaved as an office in the past? For example, only really focusing on alumni when it comes to bursary fundraising.
Well, actually, interestingly, I've been asking myself that, because if one looks at past behavior as a predictor of future behavior, then that really just reinforces that bias of, well, let's just keep fundraising from the same people all the time. And we really have to break that by starting to purposefully go outside of that group and start talking to others. I think it was interesting what you said earlier about going in with only a limited amount, enough knowledge, but not too much. And I think that's how we need to approach a lot of our approaches and asks, because what we don't want to do is keep reinforcing what could be a myth, that these are the people who will always give. We have to keep trialing outside of what we expect to make sure that actually what we're seeing in the data is true, rather than confirmation of what we already know.
Of the bias that actually has driven our behaviour in the past. And I think that one way of doing that is potentially hidden within our existing methods of regular giving and major gifts. So, for example, if your regular giving messages are going out to your entire community, so everybody's genuinely included, which of course is what you would do anyway with your regular giving, the data might be able to analyse the fact that actually, most major donors start by giving at least 3 donations that are higher than the average regular giving donation. So it's not based on most major donors are from this particular demographic group, but it's based on the first steps from regular giving out towards mid-level or major level giving tend to be identifiable by the data by this particular giving pattern. And therefore, when people replicate that pattern in future, there's a little alert that comes up that, so-and-so should probably be on your prospect list because they've exhibited the same pattern of behaviour that we tend to have seen from major givers in the past. So there's different ways of looking at it. Adriana, I would love to have this conversation again in about a year or two's time, when some of this AI development has actually happened and we're actually either playing around with these kind of new opportunities in our databases, or still wishing that they were happening because progress has been slower than we expected. But either way, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. I love that our conversation has drifted back on a continual basis to understanding that why data can be helpful in the first place, why it supports your strategic decision making but doesn't drive it blindly, and that feeling of understanding, asking the question of the data, why is the data showing us this particular pattern, so that we're actually generating insights through our own understanding of our communities and our own strategic thinking skills. Adriana, thank you so much for your time today. It's been delightful to have you here on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.